Welcome to Debt Free in 30. My name is Doug Hoyes. This is the weekly show where we talk about money, debt, and personal finance. I've got a great guest with me here today, so let's get started. Tell me, who are you? Where do you work? What do you do?
Well, hi, Doug. My name is deVries. What I do, where I work, a little complicated.
Well, and there's a bit of a backstory there, so we'll get to that. Why don't you give me a bit of your background then first? Tell me a bit about yourself, and that'll kind of flesh out the story as to why we've got you here today. What's your family situation, married,
Sure.
single? Tell me about that.
I've been married for 28 years, actually. This past Friday, we celebrated our 28th wedding anniversary. I have 3 children, adult children. One who's graduated a few years ago, another is set to graduate in a few months from Laurier, and another who's my son. So I have 2 older daughters, and my son is in his 2nd year at Laurier. Been a resident, as I said, of Brantford for a long time.
And we're here recording this in my Brantford office today, so it makes perfect sense. Your background, which we kind of skipped over at the start of the show, is you've been in the financial services industry for many years. You've had a long career with a major Canadian bank. We're not going to mention who it is, what you're doing now, because that's not really relevant to what we're going to talk about today. But tell me a bit more about your extracurricular activities here in Brantford. What do you do outside of work?
Sure. Well, I'm a member of New Covenant Christian Fellowship, and over the years it's evolved into, I guess you would call me a financial counselor, and that is people I work with in the congregation and now outside the congregation in the greater Brant County area, because they've heard of the work that we do as a church and what I do individually. So I meet with people individually to deal with, often it's around debt, often it's around challenges they're facing, situations they're in, but it's not always. It could be just about advice about how to consider future progress. What do they want to do? So it really, everyone is individual. It's confidential. There's no cost. I do it as a service, and New Covenant promotes that because we recognize whether you're in a Christian denomination or anything really, finances applies to every walk, age, and gender, really.
And I want to talk a bit more of that as we get into it. So obviously your qualifications as a financial counselor, well, it makes sense if you've worked for a bank for many years. You've obviously got some handle on money. What about in your own personal life? Are you a multimillionaire? Have you gone through some challenges in your life? Like what have you learned not only from your work experience and your education experience, but from your life experience?
Well, multimillionaire, no.
Oh, that's too bad.
Sorry.
That's too bad. Neither am I, so we're in the same boat there.
However, having said that, I come from this with a great deal of experience, both good and bad. I know certainly what it is to face job loss, redundancy, whatever those newest words are they're using. Mm-hmm. I know what it is to face separation and potential divorce, the costs associated with that. I know what it is to lose a house because you can't afford it. So when I look back over the last number of years, I've had that experience. So I can not only understand it, I can empathize with those that I'm working with as well.
So you've actually faced these things yourself in your own life, and obviously you've come through at the other end.
I have.
You like you said at the beginning, you've got a family now, you've got a house, and so that obviously makes it a lot easier to counsel people. Give me your kind of big picture theory on how finances fit into the overall picture. Is it something, as you're counseling people, that often is a big issue and is a cause of a lot of stress?
Yeah. So when I look, and my counseling involves the youngest has been about 18, and I counsel seniors right up to their mid 80s. So I've had a good broad spectrum of different feedback. And I would say that unlike many sort of key focuses in life, finances is not something that is taught well. And it's something that a lot of the people I work with have no idea about. They kind of go through life learning some tough lessons when it comes to finances. And I'm there to help teach them what it's all about, give them a lot of signs to look out for, and help them steer them. And it's not as if I've arrived. I just want to throw that in there. Financing and managing your finances is a lifelong thing. It's really establishing behaviors to keep you on the right road.
It's establishing behaviors to keep you on the right road. So what are you talking about? What do you mean by that? Give me an example of, well, maybe some behaviors that get you into trouble and behaviors
Sure.
that tend to keep you out of trouble.
Probably the behaviors that get you into trouble, I think, in today's environment is a very low interest rate environment. So money is, as they say, cheap. So I think there's less of a focus for individuals to consider what the true cost of that new car, new couch, big screen TV, whatever it might be. So that's really, they need to understand what the actual cost of that financing is and how that affects their cash flow in the end. So the other behaviors are really knowing where your money's going. It's probably the key area is having some kind of, and there's all kinds of different ways that you can do that. There's many that will have no idea where their money is going day to day.
That's fascinating that you say that low interest rates and the low interest rate environment we're in is actually a problem.
Absolutely.
If it cost me 18% interest to get a mortgage, which it actually did when I bought my first house many, many years ago, I guess we'd think a lot more long and hard before jumping into some of those transactions.
Exactly. And we see over and over again people refinancing their homes, for instance. We got a sort of a double whammy. We have the lowest interest rates we've seen in years, some historically low, but we also have house prices that have increased consistently over the last period of time. So people are taking advantage of the increased equity. So in other words, the value of their homes have increased and then borrowing it back again at a very historically low interest rate. So just makes it easy to buy those things that typically, and your example is great, that they would never think of normally at other interest rates.
Yeah, my house is kind of my cash machine. So
that's right.
Historically, if I've owned the house for 20 years, well, it's worth more than when I bought it. And if I've paid down the mortgage, great. With low interest rates, I can go to the bank, borrow more. Everything's great.
Exactly.
And what you're saying is, no, not so much. Everything isn't great. So let's get back to something else you said, which is knowing where your money goes, I think is how you put it, is critically important. So what are you talking about there? So I'm someone sitting in front of you and you're counseling me and I say to you, I got no idea where my money goes. Why is that important and what should I be doing about it?
Well, I'll give you an example. One of the first things I do when I'm counseling individuals or families, and again, this is very confidential, is I will ask them a series of questions. What money is going out? What money is coming in? And frequently, they can tell you what their paycheck amount is, but what they can't tell you is where the money was going. They'll remember the larger purchases more often than not, and typically my first counseling sessions with them last an hour or two, sometimes 3, and it really is about sort of getting a state of where they are today. And when I begin to ask the questions, often they'll, oh yeah, I forgot about that expense. Or when we're finished the tallying, they realize I spent $400 a month on certain things, whether it's fast food or cable bills or whatever that might be. And it's a real reality check for them to put it down on paper. So I recommend that they write it all down. That's the first step.
So if we're giving practical advice here, and that's kind of what this show is all about, step number 1, write it down.
Absolutely.
And okay, so what am I carrying a piece of paper with me wherever I go? Like how practically am I going to be doing that?
Well, that's only stage 1. So to know where, and as soon as you write it down, you'll recognize the areas that are of a concern. I frequently don't have to point it out to them. They know. And it's interesting to watch because if it's a couple I'm counseling, they'll say to each other, really? Do we really spend that every month? So that process is hugely impactful.
And what are some of the areas where people spend more than they think?
Well, they're higher costs. Your standard mortgage, you can't do much about those things. Although I do in-depth counseling when it comes to having to perhaps sell their home or refinance. But more often than not, we don't deal with those things. We do deal with practical things. What are you paying for your cell phone charges, your telephone charges? You'd be amazed, Doug, at how much money people are putting, a couple of $100s a month. And these are very, they have tight budgets. The other area is restaurants, dining out. It's incredible how much money is going to those things. And I'm not an advocate to stop doing those things. We need a robust economy, but it's within balance.
Yeah, and you're right. Writing it down is the first step. I mean, 20 years ago we didn't have cell phones. 30 years ago we didn't have cell phones, and now we have to have a cell phone that's web enabled, and I can get on the internet and check my Twitter all the time. So it's gone from being something that didn't exist to becoming a necessity.
Yeah, absolutely.
And therefore we've got to have the best and the brightest. So well, that's very cool. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to come back and talk about some more practical tips here. This is Debt Free in 30. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
We're back on Debt Free in 30. My name's Doug Hoyes, and I'm joined by Chris deVries, who has been walking me through the step-by-step approach he takes when he's counseling people in financial difficulty. So before the break, Chris, you said step number 1 is to
know where your money's going.
Know where it's at, write it down, let's see where you're at. And then step number 2 would be to do a bit more analysis on that.
Correct.
Where can I cut? What do I do? And you gave us a couple of examples, things like cell phone charges, things like that you kind of don't realize that if you've got a family plan and there's 4 of you in your family, then that can add up to some serious bucks. So what would be the next step then in that process?
So once we've analyzed, we have an in-depth discussion about what really is important relative. So we sort of separate the areas that we really don't want to focus on immediately. The mortgage, the car payment, if it's already there, there's little we can do. Again, we will address those if we need to, depending on the severity of the situation. But we take those other costs, and I talk to them very frankly. Why is it this? What's the underlying reason? What's the behavior behind it? In some cases, it's simply a matter of not understanding or not having the knowledge about whether it's cell phone or cooking or whatever it might be, believe it or not. And then I can steer them in the right direction to certain other professionals around those different areas. But more often than not, I give them homework, and they're to call their cell phone carrier. They're to call their insurance carrier. And in doing so, within a few weeks, they've saved themselves a few hundred a month. And often a few hundred, it just starts the ball rolling, and they get very excited.
Yeah. Well, and I guess cable, satellite, that's another obvious one too.
Absolutely.
Do I really need 9,000 channels?
Right.
And all I do is watch that one show.
Correct.
It's and I guess everyone now has cut their cable and they got an antenna and Netflix and the internet, and that's all we got. So,
right.
So your initial meeting with people could be as long as, an hour, 2, 3 hours, and then you give them their homework. They would often then come back and sit down with you a second time. Is that quite typical?
Right. I have a rule, I'll say. So I meet with them typically 2 to 3 hours, sometimes to the wee hours of the morning. I've been known to come home at 1:30 in the morning sometimes. Again, depending on the severity of the situation. But it's up to them at that point. So I give them some homework, and they're to call me. I don't own this relationship if they're serious about it. And I found there are those that are not really serious. They want to have a conversation, but it ends there. The ones that are serious will follow up with me usually within a few weeks, and we'll make the next appointment. So the ownership is always with them, because what I'm looking for is a changed behavior. If they don't change, we're going to fall in that same position again.
Well, and you and I kind of think the same way, because I, personally believe that the person who is most in charge of me is me.
Absolutely.
And unless I'm willing to make whatever changes I need to make, it's not just going to happen.
Exactly.
But it's also good to be able to lean on other people who can kind of point you in the right direction, because, hey, it never occurred to me to think of some of the things that you're talking about, and that kind of walks you through it. So when the people come back to see you perhaps a second or a third time, what are those discussions typically like? What are you talking about there?
Well, we're talking about what they did relative to their homework, and often the homework is, the first set of homework is capturing what they're spending. So I can steer them to a number of different electronic means. There's so much technology out there, or some simply have a spreadsheet that they use to track. So we'll analyze that again. But more importantly, the homework will be around, did you call the various companies? And I coach them even during that first session what those conversations need to look like. It's not an aggressive, yelling sort of idea, but it really is being transparent with these different companies and say, hey, this is where I'm at. This is what I want to do. And more often than not, when I get back with them the second or third time, we're celebrating the success, the savings they've had. And typically they will say, this is so exciting. I want to go to the next step. And the next step is really around what other behaviors are inherent in how they've run their business, their family, and what changes need to be made. And I can draw on years of experience, both myself, but also all those that I've worked with. I run a number of seminars at the church, so people are sharing their stories. So I'm just drawing on all kinds of information and sharing with them and saying, there was this situation. And it just starts to change their whole sort of behavior and how they operate.
Which is the whole key. So this show is called Debt Free in 30. We talk about, we take 30 minutes and help people be debt free. So in the people you deal with, I'm guessing that a significant number of them have debt.
Almost all of them.
Almost all
Absolutely.
of them. And so by taking a close look at my expenses, cutting down my expenses, I assume that then gives them money to free up that they can then be plowing against their debt.
Right. So the next step and sort of the big piece of this is reducing their debt. So we then look at all of their debt. We prioritize the debt. Again, looking at the highest interest rate that they're being charged on the debt. We use the extra funds that we've developed through the budgeting and analyzing to pay down the highest interest rate debt first. We develop a table with very specific goals and how long each of those will be paid off. And we set milestones of celebration when they've paid that, the $50,000 or $5,000 credit card that was paying 29%. When that happens, we celebrate, and then they go to the next step. And it's a very defined 2-3 year plan.
Do we have a really expensive party to celebrate? Or that'd probably defeat the purpose.
That's right.
So, and you hit on a key point there, and that is that you want to whack away at the high interest rate debts first, because that's the most bang for your buck, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
If I've got $1 and I can pay off that credit card where the interest rate's 29%, I'm going to save myself 29% over the next year, as opposed to my lesser line of credit or something, lesser interest rate.
Right. It's attacking the highest debt first, but also maintaining your minimum payments on the rest, because we're trying to maintain and in some cases build their credit. So there's a combination of things going on here.
Right. And that's an interesting perspective, because some people have the view that, well, what you should do is pay off the smallest ones first, because you'll feel way better if you've got
Correct.
a credit card with a $500 owing on it. Get that one out of the way and then go after the big one. Obviously, you don't subscribe to that theory.
Not at all. It needs to be the highest interest rate loan or credit card, whatever that is. And again, we show what the cost and how many years it would take to pay off the way they're doing things versus how it should be done.
Well, I'm not supposed to give my opinion on this show, but I agree with you. I think you go after the highest one. That's the biggest bang for the buck. So we're almost out of time. I'd like you to, and I think what we're going to do for our podcast listeners is throw in a bonus segment where you can maybe tell some stories about some of these people you've helped. But for our radio listeners, I'd like you to tell me, how should we end this? What's the message that you like to leave people with, either when they come in to see you for the first time or when you're in your ongoing work with them? What's the message?
I think the message, first of all, don't wait till it's too late. And it really is never too late, but don't wait till there's no other option. Often I'm brought in when we have to make some tough choices, whether that's having to sell your home or sell some other assets. I'm going to say, if you can find out early, identify, be somewhat self-aware, and come and have the discussion. Come to a seminar at New Covenant Christian Fellowship, because it's a general seminar. It's not a one-on-one. Learn some tips, and then start being transparent. And probably the most important message is that there's hope. There's hope in no matter what situation you're in, and I can tell you many stories of the hope that I've seen as a result of just working with this. So finance is a tough thing. People want to keep it hidden. I'm saying being more transparent with it, and there is hope. And
I think hope, that's a great way to end it. Chris, thanks very much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll be right back to wrap it up. This is Debt Free in 30.
You're listening to Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
Welcome back to Debt Free in 30. I'm Doug Hoyes, and it's time for the 30-second recap of what we discussed today. My guest today was Chris deVries, a financial professional who provides financial counseling through his church. Chris said on the show that managing finances is a lifelong process, and he believes it's very important to identify behaviors that cause financial problems and then take steps to change those behaviors. He gave many practical tips on how to do this, but he believes that ultimately it's up to each of us to take control of our financial life. No one can do it for you. That's the 30-second recap of what we discussed today. So, what's my take on this? Well, I agree with Chris's take charge approach. As I said on the show, the person who is most in charge of me is me. Now, that may not be the most grammatically correct sentence ever, but ultimately, the only person who can change my behavior is me. Of course, that doesn't mean you should try to do everything on your own. It's great to have a counselor like Chris to lean on and to get advice to help you make the practical changes you want to make in your life. I like Chris's example of cell phone costs. He coaches people on how to get on the phone with their cell phone provider and negotiate to eliminate unnecessary phones and services to reduce costs. The same strategy works with your cable or satellite provider and with many other expenses. It takes some work, but it's a great strategy for saving money. When it comes to paying off debts, Chris advises people to attack the highest interest rate debt first while maintaining minimum payments on other debts. This is the opposite of what some advisors suggest. They say it's best to pay off your small debts first so you have a feeling of accomplishment as you reduce the number of debts you have. I agree that if you owe $20 on an old cell phone bill, then it makes sense to get rid of it, but other than that, I agree with Chris. Pay off your high interest rate debts first. That's the maximum bang for the buck. Chris ended the show by giving two very good bits of advice. First, he said, don't wait until it's too late. If you have debt or any other financial problem, take action now. Speak to someone, do what you need to do to solve that problem. Second, he said there is always hope. No matter how hopeless your situation may appear, there are ways to deal with financial problems. Talk to a counselor like Chris, do your research, and take action. And that's our show for today. I want to thank Chris deVries for being my guest today. For more information on today's show, or any of our shows, you can go to hoyes.com, that's HOYES.com, and read our show notes, get links to everything we discussed, and even download an audio copy of the show. I've put a link to Chris's church in the show notes as well. You can also subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or any other podcast streaming software, and I encourage you to do that. Again, just go to hoyes.com, that's HOYES.com, and search for the word podcast to get full notes on everything we discussed today. Until next week, I'm Doug Hoyes. Thanks for listening. That was Debt Free in 30.